We are fortunate indeed to be in your presence and to listen to your wonderful voice, unique voice. That mix of the prosaic and metaphysical, that immediacy of your connection with history and suffering, utterly extraordinary. The professors of literature here must be having the most wonderful time. I'm lucky to begin to speak. I think I speak for many here when I tell you that we have been moved and inspired by your poetry. And that we are very fortunate that Cindy made such a wonderful introduction that allowed us to put your poetry into its framework and to see some of the themes. So some of the questions that I had, Cindy answered, and others you have thoroughly brought to the fore. So I was going to ask you about your preferred themes. I think we now know what they are. But let me just throw out the question of how did you become a poet? And when did you start writing poetry?
I think I decided that I wanted to be a poet when I was about my daughter's age. She's 9. I read a poem by Emily Dickinson in one of my school books, and I thought, oh, she knows me. And I loved that feeling of having this voice that was rhythmic and memorable in my head, speaking to me about things that I hadn't even understood about myself, but that were true, teaching me to see the world a little bit differently. And I didn't think that was a real possibility. I hadn't read any poems by poets who were alive, and so I just said, well, that's what I would love to do. I wish I could do that. And then I got to college and discovered that there were living poets. I went to readings on campus in Boston, and I got to listen to poets read and talk about their work for the first time in my life, and I felt like, it's real. This is a thing that hasn't died. It's a thing that I can, become a part of if I try. I also met other young writers who felt the same way. Maybe they were a little bit more savvy than I was, but they made me understand that if I wanted to start writing poetry, I could do it, and that there was a community of people that I could become a part of.
I have a feeling you're probably describing what some of the young people in our audience are experiencing. So let me ask you, what advice would you give to an aspiring poet? Read everything you can?
Yeah, that's the first advice that everybody gives, and it's the truest. You have to, there's no way to learn how to write, but to read. And even when you know how to write, reading gives you new tools that can make your poems reach farther, can make your poems be more courageous, more honest. I think young writers, at least if they were like me, felt like there were things that they needed to kind of hide, secrets that they wanted to get off their chest but that they also didn't want to share. And so sometimes poems can be very encoded. I think that reading the voices of other writers who are courageous, honest, thoughtful, emboldens you to be honest with yourself. And it makes the poems, I think, larger. But then the other thing that became really important for me, I thought that the poets I loved because they had such authority. They could say something that was true. And so I thought I needed to say things with authority, but I didn't actually feel like I lived with authority. I had a lot of questions. And when I discovered that I could use questions in my poems, I felt free. I felt like I was no longer locked into imitating this version of truth that I thought poets were supposed to have.
When you said earlier that you discovered yourself in the poetry of others, I was reminded of a phrase by the Spanish philosopher Ortega. Todo gran poeta, señora, nos plagia. Every great poet is a plagiarist. And so there you were, naming so what other poets do you find plagiarize you?
Gosh, I find myself in so many voices. So some of the older voices that I continue to love are voices like Lucille Clifton, Elizabeth Bishop, Seamus Heaney. Other more contemporary voices that teach me things about the world and myself. Some of them are younger, and I'm really so fascinated by and grateful for the work of poets like Eve L. Ewing, Danez Smith, Natalie Diaz, and my peers like Terrence Hayes. It's just a kind of a long list of people who teach me to see the world and myself anew each time I kind of open their books. And I feel every time I'm asked that question, I feel put on the spot because I will know that there are 1,000 more names I should have said, but I feel like there's so much happening in poetry right now. I think it's always been an urgent art form, but I feel like it's a form that's helping us bring clarity to a world that is increasingly confounded by questions of fear and anger, hatred, confusion. So poetry is this part of ourselves that's bigger than who we are, that can speak with a different kind of perspective on the world that we've made.
I like that, an urgent art form. Poetry is an urgent art form. I think that's a fabulous phrase that I'm going to plagiarize what you certainly.
I'm sure I stole it.
Well, I wanted to share with everybody here a delightful experience yesterday at the airport. I was standing feeling like an idiot with a sign that said Tracy K. Smith. And this young woman came up to me and she said, "Are you talking about the poet laureate of the United States?" I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "She was my teacher." And every professor here knows that wonderful feeling when somebody that you don't recognize comes up to you and says, Profesora, you taught me. And so she was kind enough to wait with me. And of course I said, "Oh yeah, you know who she is." And I said to her, "So what did she teach you?" And she said, "You were her mentor and you were her inspiration." And I don't know if she's here, she was going to try to call Emily Susana Ido. But when you work with the students, because this is our world, what do you, what happens between you? What do you say to them? What do they say to you?
Wow. Well, I teach poetry workshops, and so on one level, I'm trying to introduce students to more voices and more elements of craft that can help them make use of the material of their lives. When I'm working, like I did with Emily, on a year-long creative project, she wrote and many of our students at Princeton write senior theses that are basically books of poems. They do it in just over a year, which is incredible. And so in that kind of relationship, I'm helping her think about what her questions are. I'm reading the poems that she's producing each week and saying, these are the hot spots. This is what these poems seem to be about. This is what's driving them. And maybe you can amplify that by thinking about these other approaches. And then we get to a point where, there's like this whole family of poems that have been written, and I say, okay, we've looked at them individually, now we have to listen to them together as a kind of chorus and see what they say to each other, what they suggest has not yet been written but ought to be, and then, she'll go back and produce some more poems, and then I'll say, all right, now we have to make a book out of this. Now we have to figure out what the journey of this book is going to be, and so we create an order, an architecture, I like to think of it, for the book. And I learn a lot from doing that every year. And I'm thinking about the questions that are on my students' minds, which is so enlightening. They're in touch with so much that is new to me.
And how do you know when a poem is done or when a book is done?
It's intuitive. I would always get annoyed when my teachers would say, just keep going, you'll feel it. But in a way that's kind of true. When I'm working on a poem, I get the feeling that it's close to being done when I start to see things differently. When I start to realize that, like I was saying, the subject that I brought to the poem isn't the real subject. The poem has found its real material. Then I think, okay, I can do this. This poem is going to be realized. And then I start listening to language and thinking about images, as I always do, but now with the motivation of closure. And then I'll live with the poem for a little while and decide whether or not I was right, whether it really is done, or whether I need to go back and cut or add. And with a book, it's similar. I get a feeling about 2/3 of the way through that I'm on to something that has potential to be a living thing. And it has questions, it has themes, it has an arc, and I just need to draw that, kind of to a natural feeling arrival.
I have a feeling that some of the poets in the audience are going through their own process and checking off whether they do that or not. I don't want to monopolize you. Let me open these 2 questions. There are a couple of microphones, I think, or you can step up here.
You have written so many books about poems. Have you ever, after you have wrote those poems, will you think that you will write one of them or a line or something different?
Well, it's funny you asked that because Cindy mentioned the poem the poem Theft from Duende, and I'm so grateful to that poem because it taught me a great deal. There's the first section of the poem, when I read it out loud, I often don't read. I bet I would question it now if I were going to go back and revise it. I'm not sure why, but I also have this sense of trust that the poem has its own life now. It's out of my hands, and that's kind of how I feel to most of the poems that I've published in book form. Sometimes I publish a poem in a magazine, and then I say, oh, I really do want to go back in there, and I will, but the book is it's a mindful process, and I don't tend to go back and revise those poems. Sometimes they'll send me back into, the creative process to think, how would I ask this question now? But I also wanted to say, I do feel like what I love about poetry is that it makes us so willing to listen and to submit to another voice, another perspective, even sometimes another value system, and to allow ourselves to be touched by that, ideally to be enlarged or maybe even somehow changed by that. And so I think that's one of the reasons why poems are such great tools for wrestling with questions like the first question, questions of inclusion and citizenship and what it means to be a society together. I think the central question animating all of my work is, what do we do to each other? Why and how? How can we do these things? And it's a question that doesn't go away when the poem is done. So I feel like bringing that into this space is a really useful thing. Thank you.
I'm pretty loud, so.
Your name and faculty?
My name is Luisa Vigo-Cepeda. I'm in the English department in Humanities. I'm originally from Atlanta, Georgia, so it's an honor to see you. I feel like my question could be back off of Sharif's. How do you nurture or handle the responsibility to be the voice of many voices as the U.S. poetry?
When I first was beginning to start that first term, I met with one of Guy's colleagues at the Library of Congress named Rob Casper, and I've worked closely with him throughout my time as Poet Laureate. He directs the Center for Poetry and Literature within the library, and so my position is kind of in his wing. And he said, don't forget, this is not about you, this is about poetry. And I loved that because as a poet I usually just travel and read my own work, talk about it, but he reminded me that I was going to be in a position to talk about all of the many different people who are making the art form what it is. And so my way of thinking about representing has been to get out of the way and say, here's a voice, here's another voice, here's another voice, let's listen to them, let's kind of explore the feelings that these voices bring into the room. And I think that's what I'm attempting to do with this podcast, which is also now a radio program in certain places, the Slow Down. It's 5 minutes a day of poetry by somebody else. And I start by talking about some facet of life, of lived experience, a personal or social happening that seems to make space for the poem that I'm about to read. So my strategy has just been to say, what Rob said, it's not about me, it's about poetry. And these are all of the many different voices that make poetry happen right now.
Good morning. I'm studying literature in the English program, which is very open and varied. So it's one of the most open and varied at the University of Puerto Rico. Since it's not quite 11, and I was following the program, I'm very respectful, if at all possible, can you read another poem?
That's it, absolutely.
I noticed that too. I didn't wear a watch today, and then I sat down and I said, oh, I think that was too short. So this is the title poem of Wade in the Water. Thank you for asking for another poem. This poem is, well, the story behind it is I visited a ring shout in coastal Georgia, and that is a tradition that's important to African American culture. It's an event where spirituals, songs like Wade in the Water that you might be familiar with are sung, but they're also made into a kind of ceremony. And I think I see it as a ceremony of commemoration for the many generations who suffered, lost to the awful institution of slavery. And it's also a form of joy and celebration for the amazing and resilient culture that Blacks brought, to the U.S. and other parts of the world diasporically, like here. So this is a poem that kind of dips into that history, but it tells the story of this beautiful woman who greeted me and everyone else that she met by saying, "I love you." Wade in the water for the Geechee Gullah ring shouters. One of the women greeted me. "I love you," she said. She didn't know me, but I believed her, and a terrible new ache rolled over in my chest, like in a room where the drapes have been swept back. "I love you. I love you," as she continued down the hall, past other strangers, each feeling pierced suddenly by pillars of heavy light. "I love you," throughout the performance, in every hand clap, every stomp. "I love you in the rusted iron chains someone was made to drag, until love let them be unclasped and left empty in the center of the ring. "I love you in the water where they pretended to wade, singing that old blood-deep song that dragged us to those banks and cast us in. I love you, the angles of it scraping at each throat, shouldering past the swirling dust motes in those beams of light, that whatever we now knew we could let ourselves feel, knew to climb. Oh, woods. Oh, dogs. Oh, tree. Oh, gun. Oh, girl, run. Oh, miraculous many gone. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Is this love the trouble you promised?
One last chance for questions. Yes, please.
I think I can say from here. Hi, my name is Alejandra. I'm a high school student at writer and a student that wants to study here at IUP. I want to know if you've ever hit rock bottom or writer's block, and how can you overcome it?
That seems like an urgent question.
Yeah. I have. It's happened to me twice. Both times it was really rooted in the same thing. I've taken a lot of workshops over the course of my life as a student, and I was in a space, I talk to my students now, and their language for this is, I don't feel safe. It's not a safe space sometimes. Obviously that, to me, is an emergency situation, but I've been in classrooms where that's not the case, and where I was made to feel sort of unnecessary, unvalued. And so my reaction at that time was to sort of go silent, like I couldn't write because my audience wasn't listening. I learned from that a huge part of being a writer is deciding why you write. Is it for praise? If that's the case, it is not a good profession. You know, praise is not a really guaranteed outcome for writing, especially writing poetry. So there's got to be something else driving you. I learned that I needed to write poems because poetry helped me make sense of the world and of myself. And I learned that there were voices out there, maybe they were the voices in books, that helped me to feel like I was doing the right thing. And there were voices that made me feel otherwise, and I had to choose who to listen to. I think that's very important. That didn't make me leap up and get back to the page, though. I had to sort of figure out how to start again. And one of the things that I did during what was a really long and painful writer's block was to take a photography class. I learned to see moments of emotion, moments of narrative in still images by walking around with the camera and looking at things, you know, in a small frame. And it taught me that there are so many different ways of getting a sense of what's at stake into a poem. It doesn't all have to be through explanation. It can be through showing something that conveys a feeling unmistakably. And that is what brought me back to the page. The other thing that brought me back to the page was spending time in Mexico and learning to speak a new language. I spoke it much better at one point, but and feeling like, oh, English is only one, you know, arm of this thing, which is language. And that, I think, all of those things brought me back to the page, and they also kind of gave me a new sort of strength to say, I know why I'm doing this, and I think I know who I'm doing it for, too.
I think you're being very generous in sharing this with us, and I'm sure you're speaking for all here to say we appreciate it enormously. Your solidarity, your generosity, your authenticity. Thank you.